Hi, my name is Martin Purnell, and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and where we can meet and hear from those that have made their faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation. You can contact us as well by email, ogc@accessradio.biz, and biz is spelled B-I-Z. So please enjoy today's guest, who is an author, co-founder of Red Letter Christians, plus the intentional residential community, The Simple Way, in Philadelphia, which is part of the new monasticism movement. Our guest studied sociology and youth ministry at Eastern University in the mid-1990s. Our guest also worked in Calcutta for several weeks with Mother Teresa. He worked with the Iraq peace team in Baghdad for 3 weeks and saw the bombardment of that city. Our guest used a specially adapted bus running on used vegetable oil to visit cities in the USA under the heading of Jesus for President. No wonder the press call him an activist. So, what is the new monasticism movement? What was it like to set up and then live in a commune? What is the Red Letter Christians? And what is it like to set up the organisation with none other than Tony Campolo? His book, The Irresistible Revolution, Living as an Ordinary Radical, was published in 2006. What exactly is an ordinary radical? And finally, what does he think of Christianity today? And are we ever likely going to see a worldwide or even national revival in our lifetime? And if not, why not? What can we do to see such a revival? It gives me great pleasure to welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, Shane Claiborne. Shane, thank you so much for taking valuable time out. For those that don't know anything about you, they'll find out over the next hour. Hopefully we'll find out right now where we're speaking to you from, please.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. Looking forward to the conversation.
And me.
I am in Philadelphia, here on the East Coast, right between DC and New York City. But I grew up in Tennessee, so I still got my charming Southern accent going on over here.
Not that I want to stereotype you, but you can't play the banjo by any chance, can you?
I can play the spoons if I had a couple of spoons here, old school. I love me some bluegrass.
Oh, very good in your washboard. Great stuff. So let's find a bit more about you, if that's right, Shane. 5, maybe not so important questions to just kick us off to see a bit more about who you are. Question number 1, if you could invite anybody from world history for an evening meal, alive or dead, so that you could ask them questions, who would it be, please, Shane?
Oh, I saw this question. You gave me the heads up.
Yeah.
And, I started thinking, I like old Rich Mullins, a great singer and songwriter. Of course, it's tempting to bring my friend Tony Campolo back just to have a little time together, but I think he's quite happy right now. So I went with Francis of Assisi. That's my final answer.
Very good.
He's really wild. I think we'd have a good time. He'd challenge me to, go a little deeper with my discipleship of the sweet Lord Jesus. So I'm going to go with Francis of Assisi. Boom.
Well, that is fantastic. I could bore you to death about Rich Mullins.
I thought I'd throw you a few other ones out there because, good old Rich. I knew Rich a little bit, and we spent some time together. And he wrote a play and many songs, kind of attributed to Francis. So, yeah, there you go.
Well, there you go. I mean, the thing is with Rich Mullins, I had the privilege of interviewing him on stage for an hour, a bit like we're doing now. But he would play his guitar, or I want to call it a zither. It wasn't a zither, was it?
Oh, the dulcimer, the hammer dulcimer. Yeah.
Yeah, he was amazing. And it turns out, I think that was the last ever gig he did in the UK because he flew back and had that horrific car crash a few weeks later. An amazing guy.
He was, and I'm so glad I had the chance to get to know him a little bit. I'm still friends with many friends of his brother, and Mitch McVigar, one of his musicians he played with all the time. So, yeah, good times, man. And, if I had 2 choices, I could bring Francis and Rich back, and boy, that'd be a party. Yeah, I'll tell you what, right there.
Wouldn't it just? The thing is, though, by meeting Francis of Assisi, obviously, by me going back in my time machine and bringing him here, I'll obviously tell him how to speak English, so it won't be a problem, unless you're fluent in either Latin or Italian. What would you cook him for a meal, though?
Oh, well, you got to go dumpster diving if you're going to go with Francis of Assisi. So I know some spots over here in Philly. We could definitely go hit up some thrown out food for sure. Yeah.
There's a great book that came out a few years ago called Chasing Francis.
Yeah.
Have you read it?
A friend of mine wrote that, right? Was that Ian's book, right? And I'll tell you something else, Martin. I actually have St. Francis over at my house. I've got a Vatican certified relic of Francis. So I don't know if it's like his toenail or hair or what, but I've got a little Francis. I know that's a little wild for my evangelical friends and some other folks, but Catholics have a way of saving those little physical things.
I can thoroughly recommend anyone to get that book, Chasing Francis.
Yeah, Chasing Francis, totally great. Yeah.
I put the book down, thought, I've just got to go to Assisi now, if only for the wine, but also to soak in the atmosphere. What a book. And no doubt we'll find out a bit more about the legacy that has obviously been bestowed down through generations that you're now flying the flag for. Maybe we could say you are a modern day Francis of Assisi. We'll find out.
Oh, Lord, that's a little much. I like that scripture. I think of Francis like follow Francis as he follows Jesus. And he does it about as well as anyone I can think as far as reading the gospel and trying to say what if Jesus meant the stuff he said. So, yeah, great inspiration for me.
Well, that's a great answer.
And a wild dude, unpredictable. There's times where he would go on walks and just flip a coin to see which way to turn, left or right. So, I like the winsomeness of Francis for sure. Talking to the animals, you're probably bound. If you're hanging out with Francis, you're going to probably meet some, in Philly, we got a few like wild rabid raccoons, I think, and stuff. There's a lot of stray cats. I think we could find some friends, in the alleyway and whatnot.
A few friends as opposed to eating them. I was wondering what a raccoon would taste like. So that'd be quite interesting. Or maybe not.
I've eaten squirrel, Martin, but not a raccoon.
Did it taste like chicken?
No, it didn't. It tasted like squirrel, and it was pretty rough, I'm going to tell you. Very gamey. Yeah. Oh, wow. Frog legs taste like chicken.
Yeah, they're nice.
But squirrel tastes pretty much its own thing. Yeah, I'm going to have to say.
We did actually have roast hedgehog flavoured crisps in the 1980s. There you go.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Give that a go.
And they had to verify it was true. They got some person who said, yes, I've eaten hedgehog. And yes, these crisps taste remarkably like hedgehog. Francis is going to have a great time over here, isn't he?
Pretty sure he was a vegetarian. But yeah, anyway, we'll just keep it going.
Question 2. Who is your favourite biblical character or favourite biblical story or favourite parable, please, Shane?
Oh, wow. When I look at the stories of Jesus, I think the one that I would have really liked to be there for was when he pulled the taxes, the money out of the fish's mouth.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome, because a lot of my Christian friends they have this sense that you've got to give to Caesar what's Caesar's. But I think it's really interesting because when Jesus is really pressed in this particular story by all the tax collectors and, folks, he tells them to get a fish and it'll have the money in its mouth, and they pull it out of the fish's mouth. And I've always thought of that as like just beautiful street theater almost, and like Jesus going, Caesar can have his coin, but I made the fish. I think, it was Dorothy Day that said, once we've given to God what's God's, there's not much left for Caesar. So yeah, I would have loved to have been there for the old pulling of the money out of the fish's mouth. That's a pretty sweet story.
Yeah, she could have elaborated, saying there's not much left for Caesar except a salad. There would have been a joke there, but maybe not. Yeah, good answer. Thank you. Question 3. Now, you can either be Prime Minister for the day in the UK, because I know you come over here from time to time, or you can be President for the day in the United States of America. What are you going to go for, first of all?
Oh, I could go for either of those for a day. I have one day, huh?
Yeah,
I'm probably going to go for President. I think we're doing the most damage to the world right now, so I might try to take that one on.
Okay, so what law would you change or impose? Maybe a new law. What would you do, please, Shane?
I'm probably going to go with let's get rid of the nuclear weapons, just because, right now we have 50,000 Hiroshima bombs in our nuclear arsenal. That's the capacity that we have. We're the only country that's used those on, to drop 2 bombs in a week at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I just think of all the damage those could do. So if I only had one day, I'm going to make the most of it. Get rid of those nukes.
Not controversial at all. Good answer, though. But yeah, I can't see it happening somehow if you became president. Just couldn't see it happen. Question 4. Outside of family events, what has been your most enjoyable day out, please?
Okay, I'm going to get there, but I'm still on the president thing, Martin. I was thinking so I went to circus school, Martin, and it was hard to beat that. I absolutely love the circus. So my little side hobby is circus skills. So I turned 50 years old, but I can still do a backflip, and I can still juggle and stilt walk. And my wife and I fire breathe. So if I could have some circus fun, maybe I could, instead of being president, maybe I could just be in the Cirque du Soleil for a day. That'd be it. I'd be into it.
Here's a thought. When you get Francis back, you could use your circus skills of fire breathing and roast the vegetables in front of him.
I think we've got a show going here, Martin. I think we've got a show.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And finally, question 5. What has been your most embarrassing moment of your life to date, please, Shane?
My favorite embarrassing moment of late was I was in the airport. I was going to miss a plane. There was a million people in line. The flight attendant, the gate agent, she said, "Come here." And she said, "I recognize you. I know who you are." And she said, "I'm going to get you on the plane. Don't, tell all the 30 other people in front of you." So she gets me on this plane. And then as I'm going, she says, "You were so good on American Idol." So I didn't argue with her because she got me on that airplane. But
Wow.
I felt a little embarrassed, maybe just a little ashamed afterwards. I asked the sweet Lord for forgiveness for riding the wave of American Idol to get on that plane, Martin.
And who did you think you were?
I don't know, some singer, and I don't sing a lick.
The only one I know from American Idol over here is Adam Lambert, because obviously they confronted Queen. But you don't look like Adam Lambert.
No, I don't.
No. Well, congratulations anyway for being on American Idol and flying first class or whatever. That's Thank you so much for this time, Shane. I really have been looking forward to this and been apprehensive as well, I must admit, on this podcast, because I love it where it can go anywhere at all. So let's see what happens. And in my introduction, I mentioned that the press call you an activist. What do you think you are yourself?
Oh, I know what I'm aspiring to be, and that is simply a follower of Jesus. And I look at Jesus, and it's hard not to be an activist. But, I think of, faith without works is dead. I look at Jesus, and he's not just praying for the world. He's suffering with the world. He's born homeless. He's executed on a cross. I mean, you don't get killed for just speaking sweet words. I mean, I think he challenged the status quo. He said things like the last or first, the first or last. It was this. So when I look at the Sermon on the Mount, it's such a radical call that you can't help but be active. And I think one of the great tragedies in the church is that a lot of what we've done is reduce Christianity to a set of doctrines, just things that we believe on paper. And I think that there are doctrines that are so important to our Christian faith, like Jesus was the Son of God, rose from the dead. I believe those things, but I think if we truly believe them, then it's not just a way of believing, but it's a way of living in the world that Jesus is calling us to. So when I look at Christianity at its best in history, it's been disruptive. You look at the prophets, they went to jail. They challenged the way that the world was working and our priorities. So, I mean, I'm not opposed to the label activist, but I'm not sure that you can be really a Christian and not be active in the world.
But then I'm a very, believe it or not, sensitive person, and I get really upset if I upset somebody. Whereas you've got to have a hardened backbone, I would have thought, the stuff that you say. So how much of it do you say that is deliberately done to be controversial, to make people think, or how much of it is actually just you being you?
Oh, I don't think my goal is ever to just be controversial. I think my goal is always to be faithful. And yet, when I look at the world that we live in right now, where literally 10 billionaires have the same amount of wealth as half the world's population, 4 billion people. And then you read the gospel and, it's saying like the mighty will be cast from their thrones, the lowly will be lifted up, the hungry will be fed and the rich will be sent away empty. That's not Karl Marx. That's the gospel of Luke. That this gospel is so radical. So I try to preach Jesus. I try to follow Jesus. And I think we need to do that with humility too. I mean, one of the things that is very true in our country, I think it's also quite true over there, is there's a lot of self-righteousness. There's a lot of kind of moral superiority, both on the left and the right. And I think the call to humility, the call to listen, and the call to love, to be fueled by love, even for those that we disagree with, is really important to me. The one thing I got going for me, Martin, is on half of the things I feel really passionately about, I was on the other side of many of those issues for a good chunk of my life. I grew up with guns. I grew up hunting with my family. I was for the death penalty. My dad was in the military, so I didn't really think critically about war or militarism. All that for me has come both from my love for Jesus and also, I would say, from my experiences in life, like trying to lean into the poor, spending time in war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan, and those things they've fueled a passion for nonviolence that is really deeply rooted in the conviction that every single person is made in the image of God. And so we need a bigger, more robust ethic of life. When I was 20 years old and we talked about what it meant to be pro-life, we really only thought about one issue, abortion, and on so many issues, it wasn't even on our radar. Or sadly, I think America is one of the few places in the world where you can be pro-guns, pro-death penalty, pro-war, and still say you're pro-life.
Yeah.
As long as you're anti-abortion. I wanted to be more consistent with that ethic of life. Anyway, that's kind of how I land, brother. And but yeah, the goal is not to be controversial, even though I think, when I look at Jesus, he says things like, blessed are you when people say terrible things about you, and even you kind of begin to wonder if we're not proclaiming a different vision for the world that Jesus called the kingdom of God, then are we really being faithful to Christ? Because that's definitely going to challenge this world. I think of the scriptures in Romans that let's not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed. So when I look at a lot of the people I admire, like St. Francis, he ruffled feathers. I look at Martin Luther King. I mean, he went to jail and people told him he was maladjusted. And Dr. King's response was beautiful. He goes, maybe I am maladjusted. We live in a world that's become way too adjusted to injustice. And we should never be adjusted to racism and violence. And we've become way too adjusted to other people's suffering. So I don't want to get adjusted to the world as it is. And I think the call of Christ is to live into a new imagination, into a new way of living in the world. And that changes how we orient ourselves with possessions and money and power and where we think, what we're pursuing in the world. Hopefully it's the kingdom of God, as Jesus said.
Well, you mentioned that you grew up in a military household. What did your dad do?
My dad, he was really sick for most of my life. He had multiple sclerosis. And so my memories of my dad are pretty limited. He died when I was 9 years old, right before my birthday. But they're wonderful memories. He was crazy. Like he had a big afro. I think this was probably after he was in the military. But I can barely remember some of this. But she would say he would hide candy in his hair, and all that. We would jump in and try to find the candy in his afro. And I can remember laying in his sort of hospital bed and just laughing until we were wheezing. We drank Coke floats and hung out. But he had MS, and it was still quite a mystery, multiple sclerosis. And so a lot of folks didn't know how to treat it or what exactly it was. It went kind of in ups and downs as far as your well-being. So he was in a wheelchair and really bedridden for a lot of my life. But before that, he was young. He was pretty wild and crazy. Everybody said he was so funny, and that's what I remember about him. And then I grew up with my mom most of my life. I had a stepdad growing up, but he left my mom. And so my mom and I are tight. I'm an only child. A lot of the adventures I've been on, going to the West Bank and stuff, my mom's been with me. She's up here all the time in Philly hanging out. And
Wow.
She's been to death row with me to visit guys that are incarcerated. Unashamedly, I'm a mama's boy a little bit, Martin.
But it sounds like she's also your bodyguard as well then.
Yeah, I wouldn't mess with my mom. I saw the other day, she's almost 80 now.
Wow.
We were going through some of our stuff in the basement in Tennessee, and she found a pogo stick. And I look over, and my mom is, almost 80 years old, just bouncing on this pogo stick and tearing it up too, man. Yeah, I was like,
brilliant.
Whoa.
Fantastic. Just thinking here, how much do you think now, looking back on that, the fact you were brought up as an only child, really, when your dad sadly passed away, seeing your dad in a wheelchair, how much of a profound effect do you think that had for you to then say, do you know what, I'm going to study sociology at university? I
think there's all kinds of layers of that I've only like in recent years started thinking back at that. But not only my dad, having a lot of physical challenges, but my mom also she got certified as a special education teacher. And this is, back in the 1900s. And so she would bring kids home. So some of my playmates, like from the children's home and stuff, that had Down syndrome and they had different challenges. One of them couldn't move his arms or legs. We would play video games though, and he had like a suction cup that would go in his chin, and then like this little straw that was the A and B button, Martin, on the old Nintendos. I don't know if you remember those, but he would shred me, with only his chin and mouth as he's breathing in and out of this straw. And that was how he operated his remote control. All of those things shaped me for sure. And even when it came to race, the town that I was from was very segregated. we had, in my high school, the Confederate flag was everywhere. We were the Maryville High School Rebels. So it was literally on the football field. It was on our lunchroom trays. And this symbol, really of racism and segregation, I began to really want to see outside of that small bubble that had shaped me. Even my friendships, I was prom king. I always say don't be too impressed because it was a small town, but the prom queen of the, my counterpart was an African-American young woman, one of few in my high school. And so I feel like those relationships were already beginning to stretch. And also the fact that this is the Bible Belt, and also the residue and the legacy of slavery and racism was still really, really evident, everywhere. In fact, just a few years ago, after a lot of hard work, the state of Tennessee removed a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest of the Ku Klux Klan. It was in the Capitol until just a few years ago, like maybe 4 years ago or something. So, this is, and we still have the death penalty in Tennessee. We still have the electric chair. So, there's just a lot of things that I would say are still being redeemed in that hometown of mine that I love so much as well. The Southern hospitality, I grew up in the same hills as Dolly Parton. So all of that, like there's a beauty there, but there's also a real shadow, a real deep, still being healed and redeemed part of that culture as well.
I want to talk about somebody that obviously has meant a lot to you, as he has to me, and that is Tony Campolo. I've got a feeling you met him through the university. So how did you first come to meet him, and what are your thoughts about him now?
As I began to think, I want to get out of Tennessee a little bit. I want to see the world. I also thought I want to study some of this stuff, right? I want to study our history of racism. I want to study urban sociology. I want to, and so I looked around, and I found Eastern University, where Tony was the chair of sociology. I also love that Tony was an evangelist. He's a preacher. And because at this point, when I was looking at colleges, I took my faith very seriously, as I do now. So the idea that I could study sociology and study the Bible was like magic. Karl Barth said we need to read the Bible in one hand, but we need to hold the newspaper in the other, so that our faith causes us to care about this world, not just escape it and get into heaven. So Tony was preaching that kind of gospel, and I went to Eastern largely because of that. I studied sociology and youth ministry there, as you said, and Tony started as my professor and became my dearest friend and partner in ministry, a mentor. I think probably he and Peggy were the first person to write us a check and help us get started in the simple way. He was always a little bit of a devil's advocate too. So he would make sure that we were asking all the right questions, that we didn't lose our grounding on Jesus as we got involved in activism and, those kind of things. And I got plenty of Tony Campolo stories, man. And, after he passed away, right before his 90th birthday, almost exactly a year ago, right? We're right at that point. And we had a big celebration of life, and we had an in-person gathering with just hundreds and hundreds of us. But we also did this virtual thing where I did, you would like this, Martin. I did 2 truths and a lie about Tony, and they were, I got almost everybody. I even pulled off, Jim Wallace was there, one of Tony's really close friends, and I totally got him. He didn't know which one was the lie.
Well, come on, you got to give us a question then.
Okay, so here you go. One of these is a lie. Tony Campolo had class and learned with Albert Einstein, quantum physics. 2, Tony went to jail and was arrested. 3, Tony ran for Congress and won.
Well, I know that he studied under Albert Einstein because I had the privilege of interviewing him mid-1990s on a 1-to-1, Newcastle upon Tyne, in his hotel room. And my wife, by this time, was getting more and more ill, and he couldn't have been nicer if he tried. It was phenomenal. It's one of only 2 interviews that have never gone out. I'll tell you why later on off air. He then told me afterwards about Albert Einstein. Yeah, it's a great story, and how he was arrested.
Yeah. Okay, so there you go. So you got that one.
Having read his books, there's something about politics, but I can't remember what it was. And the third one was?
So did he get arrested or did he
Bound to be.
win his congressional run?
No, he's bound to have been arrested. So I'll go he was arrested, but he never went for Congress.
Yeah, he was arrested for praying in the Capitol Rotunda when they were making cuts to the poor in our country. And I actually might have got arrested another time or two with me. I can't remember. But yeah, for nonviolent, prayerful protest. Yes, he was arrested. The third one was a lie. He did run for Congress, but he totally did not win. And I had to kind of tweak that one. So I had a lie in there. So he did run, but he lost. What a great brother, man. I have a one almost 2-year-old little boy. And right before Tony passed away, we were able to take him out and hang out with Tony and Peggy. Tony got to meet my little boy, his kind of spiritual grandson. And in many ways, Tony really spoke into my life as sort of a spiritual father. He would call me up and tell me anytime he thought I needed to do something or say something different but we prayed together all the time. He's one of those folks that always held together Jesus and also justice and the concern for those on the margins. So yeah, love it.
Well, for those who don't really know much about Tony Campolo, if you go back to the start of this current year, we did a special 1-hour podcast to celebrate the life of Tony Campolo with people over here in the UK who've been personally involved, including the two lads as they were then, that brought Tony Campolo over for the first time. An amazing person, and I'm so glad I was able to meet him again over here in Northern Ireland a few years ago. And so he spent 15 minutes with my wife and I. An amazing man. I'll tell you what, we could talk about loads of things because I don't want to make this like another Tony Campolo tribute because there's so much we can learn from you. Like, for instance, you setting up this new monasticism movement, which you'd like to talk about if you want. But how about getting a bit slightly controversial, if that's okay, with my last comment? Are we ever likely to see, do you think, a revival in maybe the UK or the USA? And if not, why not? What are we going to do about it? And so I'm going to hand it over to you because I'm going to nominate you to sort it all out. Off you go.
I'm very aware of the stirrings of the Spirit and the quiet revival there. There's a lot of things happening here in the country in the U.S. of revival. This is what I think, Martin. I don't think that we can make revival happen, but we can prepare for it. We can make space for it. We can try to make room for the Spirit. I also think that a lot of times when there is a move from the Spirit, it gets really exploited or distorted, or we get distracted by the manifestations of, I don't know, whether it's just the power of God or gold dust falling from the ceiling or whatever it is. I think true revival has to also move us into the world for love and for justice. So what I see happening when we think of revival is to revive, to come back to life. I see a lot of folks that are very spiritually curious. And when they see Christians who are engaged in the holy work of justice in the world, it causes them to lean in even more. So I'm so grateful that there are Christians all over the world, in our country right now, that are speaking out against the violence in Gaza and for the children and families there, even as we ask for the hostages to be released and, rebuke the violence on October 7th. But I think in our country, there's young people that are activated around the tragedy of gun violence and the mass shootings, and they're leading the way, and saying we can do better. The environmental crisis, just so many things, Black Lives Matter movement. Young people have really been in the streets, but I think they've seen a church that a lot of times is absent or complicit or even defending the injustices. And so I meet a lot of Christians that are like, I love Jesus. I'm just not crazy about the Christians I've met. I think we've got to part of how we can prepare for revival is to work on our own hearts, our own hypocrisies and contradictions. And to use a great Campolo line here, when Tony sometimes people would say to Tony, the church is full of hypocrites. Tony would very beautifully say, no, it's not. We always have room for more.
That's great.
So I don't think that the onlooking world is looking for Christians who are perfect, but they're looking for Christians who are honest and are able to wrestle with their own contradictions and to have humility and to leave room for questions and doubt. And anyway, I think that we're poised for a new movement of the Spirit. Phyllis Tickle and so many others have said every few hundred years in church history, the church loses its way. And, in her wonderful way, she would say the church needs a rummage sale, to get rid of the clutter and the things that are kind of suffocating us, and to go back to the basics and the foundations of our faith. So, yeah.
Well, you mentioned guns, because obviously I think most people around the world would know that you're allowed to have a gun or more in America. And I'm not trying to deliberately talk about the horrible tragedy of what happened to Charlie Kirk. I just get the feeling sometimes Christians of either on the left variety or the right variety, we've lost the will to debate, to discuss. Now, I could be, for instance, totally against carrying guns. I could be totally for nuclear armament. You'd be totally against it. But it wouldn't stop us from sitting down in a pub and having a pint and talking about it. So why is there a movement, do you think, whereby we can't discuss anymore because you're automatically wrong? Or maybe I've missed the point. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot to your question. I think some of it is that we end up in silos of folks that think and talk just like us. I mean, the social media, a lot of things contribute to that. So we hear things that reinforce the things we already believe. And yet I've come to learn so much more from people who disagree with me than someone who just says amen to everything that I say. And I think there's power in collaboration. Like when, for instance, there's a whole movement of conservatives concerned about the death penalty in the United States on gun violence. As you mentioned, gun violence. There's a whole movement of gun owners concerned about gun violence. There's a whole group of hunters against assault weapons. And on the back of their shirts, it says, a good hunter doesn't need 10 rounds to shoot a deer. And they're raising the question, why do we have guns that can shoot 100 rounds without reloading? Guns like the AR-15, that are weapons of war that are legal on our streets. So I'm really hopeful on this, Martin, because when you look at the statistics, a majority of gun owners, and a vast majority, like 80 to 90% of Americans, want to see changes on gun violence. It blows away the partisanship of things when you ask questions like, not just like, should someone be able to own a gun, but how many guns? Well regulated was written into the Second Amendment in the United States. This is a really good example. I know the folks internationally, this will blow your minds, but one of the laws that we've found common ground on is called one handgun a month. It would only allow one person to buy 12 handguns, pistols in a year. And you start to say, who needs more than 12 handguns in a year? And I'll tell you who. Someone who is not making the world safer and is probably making a lot of money off of handguns. And yet, like, you see a wide majority of gun owners and non-gun owners that want that law to pass, but it didn't pass. And the reason is that we have a gun lobby that is more powerful than the people sometimes. And they've bought out some of our politicians, so groups like the National Rifle Association, it was Robin Williams, the comedian. He goes, I think all the politicians should have to wear jackets like the NASCAR race car drivers that list all of their sponsors. And yet this is where we're at in America, is that we have so prioritized the gun lobby that we've become better at protecting guns than protecting our children. And now gun violence is the number one cause of death of children and youth in America, more than car accidents or cancer. And so that's why we say you can't be pro-life and ignore gun violence. It's not enough to be pro-birth and see a child born. We've got to make sure a child is cared for and flourishes and is protected. But I see really good conversations happening. But where we get stuck, I think, Martin, is a lot of times from the political side of the lobbyists, and the money still holds many of our politicians hostage and keep progress from actually happening on so many fronts, including gun violence, which is one of the ones where you can see, like I said, 80, 90% of folks want to see change happen. Simple things like high capacity magazines, that you shouldn't be able to have these guns that can just kill so many people so quickly. That's part of what the well-regulated that, the authors of our Constitution would have wanted to see. So, yeah.
Well, let's stoke up a bit more then. I knew someone who married an evangelist and went over to America. And the last time I saw her, this goes back several years now, she still had her UK accent, but was saying that now she's living over there, she's going to buy herself a handgun, for protection. And it really floored me because it's like, hang on a minute, you're supposed to be a Christian, you've married an evangelist, and you want to carry a handgun. Now, is it me being stupid here, saying, where's your faith? I still can't tally that. So perhaps you can help me out then. What about a Christian? Should a Christian carry a handgun?
I do not see a way that we can follow Jesus and love our enemies and simultaneously prepare to kill them, because owning a gun is also saying, I feel like I'm prepared to take someone's life. And when you look at the data, you can argue data on this, like a gun in your home is more likely to kill someone that you love than it is to be used to thwart off an intruder. Absolutely. There's no question about that. Either by suicide, which is our number one cause of death, or by accident. So the idea that a gun makes us safer, or I always say it's the idolatry of guns, that we actually have convinced ourselves that more guns will solve our gun problem, right? Like, it's like an alcoholic saying, I got a problem. I need a whiskey. I got a drinking problem. Get me a drink. Because we have more guns than people in America. This should be the safest place in the world. And yet, obviously, it's not. We lead the world in casualties among our peer nations. But this is the other thing that's interesting, Martin, is a majority of Americans choose to live unarmed. So 2/3 of Americans do not own guns.
Oh, really?
What that also means is that there's a few people that have a whole lot of guns. So, a third of our country owns over 350 million guns, But when it comes to faith, I think you bring a good point, a Christian event. If ever there was a case for using a weapon to try to protect ourselves or the innocent, Peter, Jesus' disciple, had the best case in the world. The soldiers come to arrest Jesus. He stands his ground, to use the language of the NRA. He picks up a sword, cuts off one of the guy's ears. Incidentally, if, when you're asking me about the Bible stories, this is another one I would have liked to have been there for, because I would like to talk to the guy that Peter injured.
Yes.
Because Jesus heals him, right? Puts his ear back on, scolds Peter, says, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Put the sword away, man. Put it away. And the early Christians said, when Jesus disarmed Peter, he disarmed every one of us. Because if there was ever a case for trying to use violence in a redemptive way, Peter had the best case there ever was. But I think what Jesus shows us over and over, it couldn't be more clear, is that greater love is no one than this. We can lay down our life for another, but for Christ we can die, but we cannot kill. So I don't see a way to reconcile violence with the cross. And that's just where I've come to land as a follower of Jesus. And, some might call it a pacifist, but I would say that it means that we need to be active peacemakers in the world. I'm not crazy about the word pacifist, because I think even though it's not true, people associate it with passivity. That means just being against violence. But I think we got to be willing to risk our lives for love and for the sake of the cross, with the same courage that folks have been willing to risk their lives for the sword and the bomb and the gun. But a lot of this fear is manufactured, Martin. The idea that, I need a gun to protect me. And that's why I think it's not exaggerating to call this a form of idolatry, because guns and idols are things that we put our faith in. We believe that they will save us, that they will rid the world of evil, that they will do all of these things that idols promise us, and yet they can't fulfill those promises. So some may trust in chariots, some may trust in horses, some may trust in a Glock or their military. But I think the scandal of our faith is that we actually trust in God to protect us. It was funny because during COVID, you had a lot of Christians that were like, I don't need a mask because God will protect me from COVID. But then they were gun owners, I don't need a mask, but I need an AR-15. So, Lord, help us.
Yeah, that's a great point. I also picked up on what you said there about it's not majority, but stats clearly show that quite often a gun is used in the house, not to protect themselves, but is used.
And let me just say one more thing about it too, because as we researched it, we wrote a book on this called Beating Guns. And one of the things that we found is that Christians actually own guns at a higher rate than the general population. So that's where, let me just say that again, that the highest gun owning demographic in the United States are Christians, evangelical Christians in particular. And you think, here are folks that are worshiping the Prince of Peace, that are reading the gospel of love your enemies, and yet we're arming ourselves at a higher rate than the general population. That's why I think gun violence becomes a deeply spiritual crisis and a theological crisis, as much as it's also a public health crisis, as we see the loss of life. But
Yeah.
there's something about that was really eerie. It kind of gets in your soul, because you think, of all people, we should be the obstacles to violence and the obstacles, the biggest champions of life on every single issue. And I think the world's seeing those contradictions in the church and the gun-toting folks. I mean, we actually have politicians that say if Jesus had had an AR-15 instead of a cross, things might have turned out differently. Like, literally, they've said that. We've got bumper stickers with Jesus with an AR-15. Like, that is a heresy, right? That's missing the entire point of the gospel.
And I want to talk about you going to Afghanistan as well, as to why. But just to finish this particular bit then, I struggle with the idea, and this is me as well, because, okay, you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, all right, and immediately you're a Christian, but hey, wait a minute, you still got all your baggage. That isn't going to go away immediately, and yet we seem to find this idea that actually, as soon as you become a Christian, I'm now a new creation. Are you really a new creation because you still have a gun or 12 guns or whatever? What can we do about it whereby let's smell the roses and wake up a bit?
Yeah. And, there's folks that often say, well, this is not a gun problem. It's a heart problem. Or some folks say it's a sin problem, right? And I like to say it can be both. No matter how good our legislation is on guns, you can't outlaw violence or racism or hatred. So you are still going to have folks that want to hurt other people, and they will figure out a way to do it, right? And yet, we also have a gun problem, because when you look at the rest of the world, there are racist people, there are violent people, there are folks that have real mental struggles that are incidentally often make you more likely to be a victim of violence than a perpetrator. But nonetheless, like, we have violent video games, violent movies are all over the world. What is unique about America and where we stand out is our access to guns, and especially guns that can carry out so much damage. It's not just Charlie Kirk and the high-profile murders, but that same day there was a school shooting. That same day, 100 other people died of gun violence in America, and we don't know all of those names. And so I certainly grieved the death of Charlie Kirk, but we also grieve all of those other deaths. And frankly, I think some of Charlie Kirk's views, one of the places I would disagree, and I would say, like, he may not be smiling down on me, but the way that I would honor the life of Charlie Kirk is trying to work to address gun violence. Because here's another 22-year-old, I think it was, that took his life. And we don't know much about that person right now. We know that he played a lot of video games and had access to a gun, many guns. And this is a pattern in our country over and over and over, is that when you have that desire to do violence and we make it so easy to access weapons. I think it was a 12 or 13-year-old that had guns in their home that was raided here in the United States. So the wild thing is, here in Philadelphia, Martin, we've outlawed fireworks because they can be dangerous in the city. Knives have regulations on how long a knife can be. And yet we still have guns that are legal, AR-15s, assault rifles that are legal. And so we can do better. Martin Luther King, Dr. King said, a law cannot make a man love me, but it can make it harder for a man to kill me. And I think Dr. King is right. We should make it harder for people to kill. And right now we're making it really, really easy.
Good point. Thank you for sharing that. And I did say about your book, what exactly is an ordinary radical? Well, you've given us enough ideas already. Another thing about being a radical would be going over to Afghanistan. And ever since that really hit the news in the early 80s in the UK, when Russia was there, then it's never left us. So why did you want to go to Afghanistan?
Well, I went to Afghanistan. I was in Kabul for just a brief period, but I also was in Iraq for a longer period. And what happened really was after September 11th, our country was reeling, and there was the pain, the loss, the sense of fear, anger. One of the responses of that was that the war. And in fact, in Philadelphia, someone dropped a banner that said, "Let's kill them all and let God sort them out." And so that was one response. And yet I heard of another group of people that were victims, that their family members were killed in the 9/11 attacks. So, and I'm always aware that some of our listeners weren't born there, yet. So this was, in 2001, the attacks in DC and New York took over 3,000 lives. And these were the family members. So husbands, wives, like children that lost their parents. And they got together as a support group to grieve. But then as they saw the retaliation of war, they said, our grief is not a cry for war. We don't believe that more violence is going to heal the wounds or bring back our loved ones. And so they spoke out against the war. They began taking delegations to Iraq and Afghanistan. And these were family members who lost their loved ones, directly impacted people. And I got a call, would I go on a similar delegation with a group of Christians and others? And so I went in March of 2003. And, we didn't really know at that point, but this is when the shock and awe campaign happened. So 900 bombs a day were being dropped on Baghdad while we were there. So we saw horrific things, and we're trying to document that. We were volunteering in hospitals, but it shaped my faith, my convictions, and it also widened my purview of the church globally. Just one quick snapshot. While we were there during the bombing, we had a prayer meeting. We had many prayer meetings, but this one in particular was just filled with thousands and thousands of Christians. And they flowed into the streets because they couldn't get into the sanctuary. And we prayed together for peace. And then one of the bishops pointed to the cross, and he said, "This cross doesn't make any sense to the wisdom of this world," quoting scripture. He says, it's a, kind of foolishness to this world's wisdom, but this cross is the essence of God. It shows us that we should love our enemies, that there's something worth dying for, but nothing worth killing for. And so then the whole place started singing Amazing Grace in Arabic. And I was so moved. I kind of went to the altar and prayed, and I had this amazing, powerful spiritual moment. But then I talked with one of those bishops, and I said, I was very excited and charismatic. And I was kind of like, I can't believe there's so many Christians in Iraq. And the bishop said, yeah, this is where it started. And then he pointed out the window, and he's like smirking, and he goes, "That's the Tigris River and the Euphrates. Have you heard of them?" He said, "The Garden of Eden's right down the street." And then he said this, Martin, he said, "You didn't invent Christianity in America. You just domesticated it. And we want you to tell the church in the United States when you go back that we are praying for them to remember who they are and to be that conscience and prophetic voice of God, to follow Jesus," he said, and preach what Jesus preached. Live by the sword, die by the sword, love your enemies, all of this. And so that absolutely shaped me, and those words kind of echo in my soul as he said, "You didn't invent Christianity in America. You just domesticated it."
That's great. And I'm very aware of the time as well, because we're rapidly approaching the last question. The last question is, as always, who is your Christian hero? And if it's not Tony Campolo, there's something seriously wrong. I'm looking forward to finding out what the answer is. Don't tell me just yet. But that thing about you just domesticated it as a Christian, that's a great line. Ordinarily speaking, I know we're saying that you could be a friendly radical, a nice Christian radical from what you've shared, but your faith has actually, as you said, got a lot further on, whereas other people have gone the other way. They might have had a family member shot dead. They might have lost other friends or even another loved one in 9/11, and they could say, well, how can you explain this loving God? I've got a family member that's dying of cancer or whatever, and they could come up with all these genuine reasons to say, no, I'm sorry. And they're listening today to this to realise that actually this Shane bloke, he might have something. So I'd like you just please to say to those people who are listening and feel like that, what would you say to them?
Probably would prefer to listen, because I think that Christians have been very quick to speak and to provide answers to questions that sometimes I see folks that are that those answers haven't worked for them. I literally was talking with someone that there was a 14-year-old young girl that was sexually assaulted and raped, and talking about how could God allow this to happen. and a pastor told them God had this happen for a reason. And that's really messed up theology, I think, And so as I was talking with this person, a part of what I think we've got to do is say there are things that we've tried to do to understand God that just haven't worked, but it's the boxes that we've tried to put God in. So I don't believe that God has 14-year-old girls get raped for a reason. I think that God suffers with those who suffer. And so I think there's some people that we may think that we've given up on Christianity or something. I'm not trying to prescribe or diagnose everyone, but sometimes we've just given up on Calvinism or we've just given up on one particular construct and theological box that we've tried to put God in. And I think of my friends in Palestine and Gaza right now, like Mother Teresa, who's a really dear friend. He was asked, where is God in the midst of the violence in Gaza? And he said, Christ is in the rubble. And it inspired, actually, I know folks are listening, but I have a painting behind me, Christ in the Rubble, that has Jesus and the Holy Family underneath the wreckage of war. To me, that is very good theology, because the way I understand Jesus is that God left all the comfort of heaven to join the struggle here on earth and was born into not just any human body, but into a brown-skinned, Palestinian, Jewish, refugee baby who was born in a manger because there was no room in the inn, who lived into the human struggle. And so God is with us. I mean, that was another, way of talking about Jesus was Emmanuel. We sing it at Christmas sometimes, God with us. But this is like God's solidarity with suffering humanity, that God is with those who suffer, with those who grieve. And that's why when Jesus gives the Beatitudes and blesses the people, he blesses the people that this world has crushed. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are you who mourn. That means blessed are the mothers in Gaza. Blessed are those who are hurting and persecuted. And so that is good news. And I believe the gospel is always good news to the poor and to the suffering. If it's not good news to the poor, then it's not the gospel of Jesus. The fact that there is a God with us, a God who not only entered the suffering, but I think of the profound thought that Jesus felt at one point so abandoned by God that Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, you can ponder on that one for a little while, right? Even God felt abandoned by God. So that's part of what I think it means to be human. I also believe that Jesus was fully divine, so I think we feel both of those. You can feel at times like there's a God that's abandoned us, even at other times that we might feel that there's a God so closely with us. Yeah, man, that's what I would say. And I would say maybe don't give up on Christianity because of one version of Christianity that has often been distorted or even just kind of constrained by theological boxes. I think of Gandhi when he was asked about Jesus. He said, I love Jesus. I just wish the Christians acted more like him. So I think it's important to realize that there are often competing narratives of Christianity, and one of them can sound a lot like Jesus, and another times, I think we're very aware of that in the United States. There are things that try to camouflage themselves as Christianity, but they don't look like Jesus. They don't sound like Jesus. They don't love like Jesus. They don't welcome immigrants and refugees like Jesus. And if it's not about hospitality to the stranger and caring for the sick and visiting the imprisoned and making sure that the hungry have food, then we shouldn't call it Christianity, because that's exactly what Jesus says that we should do in the world, is care for the most vulnerable.
See, I don't think you're radical at all. It's obviously a label. It's a good word to use, but that's maybe what we should be aspiring to anyway. It doesn't mean you can't have money. Of course you can have money. It's surely what you do with it. What is going to be inspiring you, do you think, over the next few years before we hopefully can meet up again and see what you've done?
Oh, I'd love it. Yeah, I'd love it. Well, the word radical, I've found it helpful to reclaim the word, because the word actually means root, like a radish. It literally, the word radical means that we're getting at the root of something. And that doesn't just mean extreme or outrageous, but it means to be true, to really get to the core of what it is. And I think that kind of radicalism is what we need. And in the end, Jesus says this, that all the law is summed up into this: love God and love people. He said that they will know that you're Christians by your love. So that's radical, is love. It's getting to the very heart of this is love. I like how Barbara Brown Taylor, one of the great theologians over here, she said, in the end, if our theology doesn't make us more loving people, then something's wrong with our theology. She said, if I have to choose between loving my theology and loving my neighbor, I'm going to choose to love my neighbor, because God never called me to love my religion or love my theology. So it should make us more loving. And that's, I think, what radical is about. Now, Mother Teresa said following Jesus is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Because if we're loving our neighbor as ourselves, it may keep us up at night when our neighbor's in a cardboard box or children are starving in Gaza. What does it mean to love those people as I love myself? So I think that's the kind of paradox, is that it is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. I mean, we're being called to carry a cross. We're being called to be willing to die. It's a call to follow Jesus, is to abandon everything. But in the end, even our possessions, it's about love and relationships. It's not just about the possessions. Like when I look at the early church, it says they shared everything in common. But that was the description, not the prescription. It wasn't just about socialism or communism. I think it was more radical than Marxism, because it was rooted in a love that said, until someone else is able to eat, I will fast. I will go without until we can feed everyone. That's exactly what the early church did. They said, if you have an extra coat in your closet while someone's cold on the street, then you're a thief. You've stolen it. I mean, that's exactly what they were saying, right? It's because of our love for our neighbors that we hold our possessions with open hands. But it's love that compels us. And so that call to love is at the heart of the gospel. And that's why I also think it's the sniff test. It's the litmus test, right? For anything being Christian, if it isn't loving our enemies, if it isn't loving the people vulnerable, if it isn't wrestling what love looks like for children in Gaza and for refugees coming from really terrible situations, if we don't have compassion in our hearts and a love for them, then we need to come back to God and allow God to transform our hearts. So I'm aspiring to live like Jesus meant the stuff he said, man. And I keep going back to the Sermon on the Mount. So if someone's listening in and they're like, this is interesting, where should I start? I would say, start in the New Testament with the red letters, the words of Jesus in Matthew 5, and just say, what if Jesus meant this stuff?
Wow. I'm so glad I nominated you to sort the world out and bring revival. I'm so glad I chose you. Oh, is it something to do with me as well? We'll work on that one. That is fantastic. And if you could do a Tony Campolo impersonation, people would have thought, oh, we've been listening to Tony Campolo right now as well on that. That's a compliment. That's a compliment.
Oh, if Tony were here, he often closed by saying, in the end, if Jesus is right, and I believe Jesus is right, then all of us will be gathered before God, and we will be asked a few questions. It won't just be a doctrinal test. Virgin birth, agree or disagree. Was the world really made in 7 days? Is it 6,000 years old? It won't be all the doctrines, but it will be God saying to us, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me something to drink? When I was a stranger, did you welcome me in? We always said, Tony and I, we always say, it's not that our works earn our salvation. Our salvation is through Christ, but our works demonstrate our salvation. If we truly love God, then we can't do anything other than make sure that we take care of the most vulnerable people among us. So thanks, Tony. Yeah. And thanks, Jesus. Yeah.
You've got the last 1 minute to tell us who your Christian hero is, please. And if it's not Tony Campolo, there's something seriously wrong. Or maybe it's not. Who is it, please?
Yeah, I mean, we'll go with Tony on that. Next time we can talk about Mother Teresa, because she's up there, what an incredible woman. So, yeah, bless you, my brother.
It's been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Cheers. God bless. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. It really means a lot. Thank you very much indeed. Next time on Off-Grid Christianity.
I needed to learn to walk by faith again. And I spoke to my church leader and said, I'm thinking about all of these other job possibilities and opportunities, and I'm just feeling a bit exhausted by chasing after them and not knowing where God is going. He said to me, what do you have faith for? And I said, I think it's for this particular organization. And he said, well, why don't you just trust God and wait on him for that? And in that moment, the thought that came to my mind is, so many people in my life, when I was a church leader, didn't really listen to the advice that I gave. I feel convicted that I should listen to my pastor's advice. And so I did. And I kind of learned just to wait on God for that job, for a particular job at this particular organization. And it was really difficult. I had to hang in there. Money was tight. We had a particular deadline when we needed something to come through, but he did come through. And through that journey, I learned this is where I'm meant to be because God provided it. And I didn't feel like I forced the door open. I was there, I was obedient, but ultimately said no to a lot of other things so that I could hear his yes much more clearly.
So please join me and special guest, former barrister and leader of Westminster Chapel in London, Howard Satterthwaite. Until then, cheerio.